Hey Team Bio, welcome to your survivorship curve screencast. Okay, so, oops, I meant to erase these things, sorry. This is a survivorship curve. We have oysters, squirrels, and people. Notice that the x-axis is the percentage of maximum lifespan. People and squirrels generally do not live for the same amount of time. People live much longer than squirrels, but they also have we can normalize their maximum lifespan and display it on the x-axis here. Percentage of maximum lifespan down here. Everyone dies eventually, but not all species are dying off at the same rate over time. That's what this graph is showing us. And then the y-axis is a log scale. So you'll notice that if this distance is x right here, the distance between 0.1 and 1, the distance between this and this is 10x. And then the distance between here and here relative to here and here is 100x. So if we were to represent this on a non-logarithmic scale, these distances, this would be the longest distance between these 2 points, and this would be the second longest distance, and this would be the shortest distance. Okay, so knowing that it's a log scale on this side, and this is the percentage of maximum lifespan, we can look at these survivorship curves. You see, everybody lives for a little bit of time. However, not everyone survives at the same rate over time. If you look at humans, most humans are surviving through infancy. And if you look at 50% of the maximum lifespan, let's say just for ease of numbers, maximum lifespan is 100, we see that pretty close, like maybe 98% of people are surviving to age 50. And then over time, say we get here to age 80, now only 10% of people are surviving, and then eventually everybody dies. If we compare this to the life history traits of an oyster, we see that in the beginning, for an oyster, it's not very likely that you will make it very far in life. Only 10% of oysters are around at like 5% of their lifespan. And only 1% of oysters are around at, I don't know, maybe this is even like 2%. And this is 5%. And if we get down to 50% of the lifespan, we see that only like 0.1% of oysters are still alive. So if you're an oyster, the likelihood that you will die in infancy, oysterhood infancy, is very high. But if you survive to, let's say, if you survive your 20s as an oyster, then the likelihood that you'll make it all the way to 100 is very high. So if you're a squirrel, you could die at any moment. There's no, well, I mean, it's a log scale, so you're slightly more likely to die up here than you are as an infant than you are as an adult. But for the purpose of this graph, you can kind of think of this as squirrels. They could go at any moment. There's no part of their life where they are equally, where they're more or less likely to be eaten or squashed by a car. Which is happening all the time right now. Have you noticed the number of squirrels on the road? It's kind of sad. Okay, so we can separate these types of survivorship out into 3 categories here, but we're going to talk about 2 distinct categories. The R strategists, or type 3, and the K strategists. Which is type 1. Okay, general characteristics of type 3 survivorship curve, or R strategists. They often have many offspring. They're often small-bodied and fast maturation, So they reach reproductive age relatively early. Sorry, I'm going to move this around if you already wrote this down. I'm very, very sorry. Okay, there's little to no parental investment in raising these babies. And the strategy is basically flood the environment, create as many babies as possible, and in doing so, we are going to create a lot of diversity. Much diversity. We are going to maximize the odds that we are going to create one oyster that has the right characteristics to allow it to survive into adulthood, rather than the case strategists that are the opposite, that we'll talk about in a second. So we call this an R strategy. Sophia pointed out today that no organism can sustain exponential growth forever, and that's totally true. But we can maximize our R, or our per capita rate of increase. So organisms that have a huge R, they increase very rapidly under the right conditions, are called R strategists. Now, these types of organisms thrive, and we see explosions of their populations when resources are abundant, and they often colonize areas that have experienced a recent sudden change to the environment. So, for example, a wildfire or volcanic eruption, or a human disturbance to an area. We'll see R strategist type organisms colonizing that newly available area very rapidly. Okay, K strategists, they have an opposite life history strategy. Often they are large-bodied. Often they are long-lived. Oh, I should have put short-lived over here. Often they develop slowly. They produce few well-cared-for offspring. Okay, and the reason why we call these K strategists is because the population size is generally near or at the carrying capacity. So population growth is not limited by, well, I guess I should say it the other way. Population growth is limited by density-dependent factors. So K-selected organisms gain an advantage by allocating energy to themselves or their descendants. And they thrive in stable climates where there's a very small opportunity for rapid population growth, which is why we call them K strategists. They are generally living at or close to their carrying capacity within the environment. Okay, and we often see K strategists win out long-term in kind of a stable climax community, which we'll talk about more when we talk about the idea of succession, how an ecosystem generally changes over time after a disturbance to what's called a stable or climax community. Okay, but more on that later. What did I want to talk about? Oh, yeah. Okay, so whether or not you are an R strategist or a K strategist can depend on the environmental context in which you are living. So imagine we have a pool. These pools are isolated from one another, and they contain guppies, and they also contain predators. So in one pool, this is a study that actually took place in, I think it was Trinidad, where we have a certain type of predator, killifish, which preys mainly on small guppies. And then in another pool, we have pikes that prey mainly on large guppies. And the characteristics that we see of the guppies in these pool is in pool 1, guppies are larger at sexual maturity than those in the pike pools. And in pool 2, when we have pikes, guppies are smaller at sexual maturity than those in the killifish pools. So in this environment, it pays to have more kind of parental investment in babies, care of them, and so it pays to have more of a K-type strategy. So this is a K, more like K-type in pools that have killifish. And in pools that are full of pike, it pays off to reproduce rapidly and to have more of an R-type strategy because you want to have a ton of babies and flood the environment. Okay, so what happens if we take guppies that have had an R-type life history characteristics? They're generally smaller and mature faster, and we put these types of guppies into an environment with killifish. So someone actually did this study. So remember, the killifish encourage a more K-type life history characteristics. So if you take guppies that had previously experienced an R-type selective pressure, and then we put them into an environment where now they're experiencing a K-type selective pressure, we actually see the results here. Here are control guppies that had pike as predators, and then this is guppies that were transplanted from pike as predators to killifish as predators. So we see here that the mass of the guppies at maturity in the controls are in blue, and so males, and then the experimental, so moving them to a killifish population, we see that after 11 years, that males were slightly larger than the control males, and the females were also larger than the control females. And then the age at sexual maturity increased between the guppies that had been moved and then the control guppies as well. So we could take guppies that had an more R-type strategy, and over multiple generations, we could then select for guppies within that variable pool that it had a more K-type life history strategy, and eventually over time we'd see the evolution of the population as a whole. So that is all. I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that the environmental context depends on whether you're more K-typed or more R-typed. And I guess the last thing I want to talk about with the survivorship curves is I've kind of given the appearance here that this is happening amongst animals only, but plants or fungi can also have kind of R or K-type survivorship life history traits. So a dandelion would be an example of an R strategist. It reproduces rapidly with tons of seeds with very little parental investment, whereas an oak tree would be more of a K strategist. It's a large-bodied, long-lived organism, and it's showing care for its offspring by packing its nuts, its acorns, a chock-a-block full of tons of energy. So we are producing relatively few but well cared for offspring in the context of an oak tree. Okay, that is all.